Welcome to Southern Fried Asian. I am Keith Chow. I have a very special episode lined up for this show. I'm talking to some professional Southern Fried Asian podcasters. I was recently contacted by some folks who are doing a show out of Louisville Public Radio called Where Y'all Really From, which is essentially the same mission statement that Southern Fried Asian is. It's basically talking to Asian Americans who have a unique experience of growing up in the South, and in their case, particularly in Kentucky. So I have the hosts of that awesome podcast joining Southern Fried Asian today. Please welcome Charlene Buckles and Dan Wu, the hosts of Where Y'all Really From.
Howdy, howdy.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks, Keith. Hi, everyone.
When you said welcome, I was waiting for like an audience applause or something. Like a little
that's in
applause
post.
to go on.
That'll come in post. That'll come in post.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I just wanted to start by asking, because your show, Where Y'all Really From, has been on for how many months now? Like it's been a few, right?
We just started. So we recorded everything within like 2 weeks, minus like the season finale. And so that was like the idea came up in May. We recorded everything the first 2 weeks of June, and then we launched in September. And so now it's December. So it's been a very wild 6 months or so.
Quite a 2021. Writ large for everybody, I guess. But so what was the inception of the idea for Where Y'all Really From? As you said, like the idea started in May. I mean, May was API History Month. It was also when like all the shit was going down when you're being Asian. So was that what started? Was that the inception?
Yeah, unfortunately it was. The shootings in Atlanta kind of, I think, really kind of awakened a lot of us from whatever kind of stupor or whatever that we might have been in, and to kind of really think about doing something kind of activated a lot of us. And so my friend May Suramek, who's a restaurateur in Berea, Kentucky, not far from Lexington, she and her new friend, Nima Kulkarni, who happens to be the only Asian American state representative in Frankfort for the state of Kentucky, they got together and started talking about like, hey, let's do something. And they weren't quite sure what that something would be. And then one of them said the word podcast, and May immediately said, hold on. And she literally that moment added me to the call, because I've done multiple podcasts and radio shows in the past. And just that one conversation, they started saying like, hey, let's do a podcast that's never been done before, which is about AAPI folks in Kentucky. And I was immediately like, I'm in. And how Charlene got in was really interesting, because in the wake of the Atlanta shootings, the two of us separately had been on various sort of panels and discussion groups and presentations about anti-Asian hate. And so I had actually watched one that Charlene was a panelist on, didn't know her at all, really enjoyed what she had to say, really enjoyed her just general vibe and demeanor. And I was like, hold on, I'm going to need some help. Let's bring in a co-host. And then I called up Charlene. And Charlene at first was you were a little hesitant, right?
Yeah, I mean, because I was 3 months postpartum at that time. Like I had my second child back in February. And then, of course, a month later, Atlanta happened. And usually, when those things happen, I tend to activate. I try to, I need to like get out, like do something, like Dan was saying, do something. So actually, if this was a movie, it would like, we would just like have like parallel cuts of like all the four of us doing these things. And then it all kind of like converged together in May. But yeah, I was on a panel during my maternity leave where I kind of lit it up, I guess. And I think that's why Dan was like, we need to talk. And then that conversation was like the first week of May. And then we started the group text, all of that different stuff. I had to go back to work June 14th. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, if we're going to do this, we need to wrap it all up by June 14th. So then and actually a friend of mine had said, go contact Louisville Public Radio and pitch it. And so that's when I had contacted our awesome producer, Laura Ellis, pitched the podcast. And then she was like, oh my God, this is awesome. Let's do it. And it all kind of went from there.
Yeah. The kind of, like you said, the unique aspect of the show, right, is to focus on specifically Asian Americans in Kentucky, which is like a microcosm of this show, right? Like I had the same idea a few years ago. It's like the stories of Asian America tend to be pretty
coastal
for sure, right? The stereotype of the Asian American immigrant story is Chinatown or the Bay Area or like whatever kind of like New York, LA, San Francisco is where all the Asians are. And then as someone who grew up in Virginia, as someone who grew up in the South, it's always like a surprise that there are Asians there. And, I mean, maybe less so nowadays, but like, as Asians in the South, like, why do you feel like we're often ignored if we don't fit into the box of what like an Asian American is supposed to, like living in an enclave or like, sipping boba tea or whatnot, you know what I mean? Whatever the Asian stereotype is, right? Like, because that's part of it. Like we kind of perpetuate ourselves by, turning up our nose at like, Panda Express or whatever.
I mean, I do think, and I think it's really important to note that like being in the South, there is a huge, huge history here of Black Americans with slavery and civil rights. And so there's really strong racial dynamics and racial tensions that are happening between the white people of the South and Black Southerners, people of the South as well. And so those tensions are still incredibly strong, especially in 2020. Like I think that was really interesting because we knew that there was a rise of Asian hate after COVID. We had our then president calling it the China virus and all these different things. There was an incredible amount of discrimination and hate and violence against the AAPI history. At the same time, George Floyd happened, Breonna Taylor. I mean, all of these things that were like very much pivotal in the fight for freedom and civil rights in America. And where we had police officers who were flat out killing people. And that did have to take precedent. And it wasn't until the winter of 2021 when they said, oh, well, this is happening as well. And I don't know. And it seems like people couldn't hold both of those things. So often we get put to the side where it needs to be an and conversation. Like we are here as well. We are also a part of the fabric that is the South. We are also part of the fabric that is Kentucky. But I do think in the South, particularly because of the historical context that is, the Southern story of how wealth was created by the backs of Black Americans getting taken away from their homelands. That is a huge part of the Southern story. And like it, and I personally feel like it is okay. Like that needs to be told, but I do think people need to recognize that there are multiple stories and you could hold multiple narratives at the same time.
Yeah. The stuff that came out of Atlanta for me was the thing that really made me think about killings and all the killings of Black folks that have been going on for, hundreds of years. The thing that it made me think of immediately was like, we can't come out and say like, oh, our people, quote unquote, our people are being hurt. Therefore, we have to come out for our people and say, quit hurting our people. Ultimately, we have to come out for each other, right? All these different marginalized groups have to step up and support each other. I've come to realize one of the greatest powers of white supremacy is its power to divide and conquer us, is its power to give us this scarcity mindset. Like there's not enough justice to go around for everybody. Yep. There's not enough attention to go around for everybody. If you're supporting, Black Lives Matter, then, we don't have time to think about Asian hate. And none of that is true. You know what I mean? None of that is true. So for us, we live in a very interesting intersection of things where we're not thought of very much in the South. We're not thought of as a thing. We're not thought of really as existing. And in a weird way, we're not necessarily as tied to those kind of big city or coastal stereotypes because people literally kind of don't know what to make of us, especially if they meet an Asian face that speaks with a Southern
with
drawl,
a twang,
like,
right,
with a twang. They don't know what to do.
I mean, that's always the thing, right? It's always like I can't imagine that's. I remember there was a video that went viral of some Mississippi Chinese on YouTube, and like everyone was sending it to me. It was like, this is your thing, isn't it? It's like, I'm used to seeing Chinese people with Southern accents. It's not that impressive.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's a really good point about solidarity because, the other thing about the Asian American project writ large, beyond just even in the South, is, there's a very popular book that's out. We won't name names, but there's a very popular book that its thesis is essentially like the term Asian American is ridiculous. And why have this community of people who are, from everything from Chinese American businessmen to, Indian American doctors to undocumented Filipino immigrants. Like you have it's such a broad category. Why it's too ridiculous to even be considered a category. And to me, I almost feel like, that's the whole point of Asian America, right? Is that we are this broad, diverse, like if we were to just say, yeah, that's right, it's ridiculous. Why should we all be in solidarity with one another? Like if we can't be in solidarity with other Asian communities, then there's like no hope for America, right? Like isn't the whole point of America is that it's all of these different communities bumping up against each other, but trying to form community, trying to form identity. Like what is your thought process? I mean, have you ever like interrogated like the term Asian American Pacific Islander, like putting all of these various groups together into one box? Do you find it's limiting? Do you feel like, like my perspective is that's why we're part of this project. We want to find solidarity with other people. If we can't be in solidarity with other AAPI folks, we can't be in solidarity with anybody.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really interesting. And actually, I think Dan was the one that asked me that in the panel about how you feel about like the AAPI name. And I do think, like personally in Kentucky, where there are not many communities that I've had in my experience. I grew up in a very small town in northern Kentucky. I went to a very predominantly white high school and college and live in predominantly white spaces. And so I hold a lot of multitudes in my identity. I hold being an immigrant, being an undocumented immigrant, being an Asian, being an API, being Filipino American, and all of these different identities we could all hold because I had to find that community. I needed to know, like, I'm not alone, but also I do think that it's not, again, and it's not either or, that I have very similar shared experiences with someone who identifies as Latinx and also identifies as an undocumented, a former documented immigrant. So there's a lot of we need to be able to come together in our commonalities, those shared experiences and lived experiences. And like Dan said, I do think that it is a tool of white supremacy to divide us rather than unite us with all of these similarities.
To me, when you start studying like the history of Asian American activism going at least back into the 60s, but further, you realize like the term Asian American is a political term. It came from, activism. And, as you said, it's too huge of a blanket term for a group that I believe we're the most economically diverse ethnic group, quote unquote. The range of sort of socioeconomic status is huge and wide. So you can't put us all in one bucket and say we all have the same experience. My immigration experience in the early 80s is not the same as, among refugees, immigration experience or someone coming today. There's such different experiences. Where we end up being united is kind of in the face of other people who want to kind of lump us together. So to some degree, in the beginning, it feels like we didn't have a say in being Asian. Like everybody just, we have all grown up being called not just racial epithets, but the wrong racial epithets.
Right. Get your racism right.
Yeah, exactly. Every Chinese person has been called a Jap and a Gook and whatever else. So we kind of come from that, but I think we try to reclaim it and use that term of Asian American as, something that we can hold power with. I had a recent discussion. I'm a part of a group that's mostly University of Kentucky academics. We got this grant to do an AAPI oral history project here in Kentucky. And we had a long discussion about the acronym AAPI because the PI is for Pacific Islander. And we were kind of racking our brains thinking of Pacific Islander participants to the project and interview subjects to the project and other people to be in the group. And we weren't coming up with a lot of folks. And so the discussion was, is it disingenuous to call it AAPI when it's mostly Asian American and not Pacific Islander? And I'm sure the same debates are happening with phrases like BIPOC, where you're putting indigenous up front, but how much are those folks, represented or being advocated for? Are we just paying lip service to groups? It's so complicated.
But it's also like intersectionality, right? Like I think that's these kind of like acronym groups like LGBTQ, AAPI, BIPOC, like all of these. I mean, that's ultimately puts intersectionality at the front because it's like you can be all of these things, right? Like I think the AAPI, like the PIs in particular, is the intersection between Asian American, Pacific Islander, and indigenous populations, right? So we can have, that's where we can build solidarity between groups. Like Cherokee Nation and Native Hawaiians have a lot of similarities because they've been colonized by, Europeans, as specifically Americans, right? But that at the same time, Native Hawaiians and Chinese Americans have, unique intersectionality too, because of just the Chinese populations and Japanese populations of Hawaii and all that kind of stuff. So like, I think ultimately, right, these kinds of like solidarity and bridge buildings between communities should not be looked at as a demerit, but like as an opportunity. And I think ultimately, like you said, Dan, so eloquently about like the whole point of white supremacy is to kind of divide and not build the intersection, not to build the bridges. And I think sometimes we fall trapped to that when we say, yeah, we shouldn't be a group. We should just be our own thing. And it's like, I think what Charlene said too, I think that's also easier when you're in San Francisco, because you can just be a Chinese American community. You can just be a community of whatever ethnic group you are. You can just be Indian American. You can just be Japanese American. But when you're in Northern Kentucky or rural Virginia, if I see a Filipino person, we're going to instantly connect, even if we have very different backgrounds. There's still things that we have in common. And that's the whole project of being Asian American, in my eyes, at least. And I think it's easier for like Southern fried Asians to kind of see that than maybe someone who's a little bit more entrenched in like the community.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you're going to lean towards like your numbers, you're going to lean towards like you want to be a part of a community and share similar experiences to know you're not alone in those experiences. And whether that means you're embracing all those parts of your identity. I mean, in Kentucky, there's like 1.9% AAPI, according to like the 2020 census. And like within that, it's like 0.3% RPI, or Pacific Islanders, who identify as Pacific Islanders. I mean, that's not a huge percentage of the population, but when you look at the numbers, it's around 70,000 people. And so you want to be able to share those experiences and connect with all of them, because you're still a very, very, very small minority in the bigger picture.
Yeah. What I find interesting about sort of my experiences and who I kind of bond and connect with is I would probably have way more in common with Charlene, being essentially, I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant. I came here as a kid, but essentially kind of second generation kids, being that third culture kid straddling the cultures of our parents, world and history and, the new world, quote unquote, the world that we live in. Those of us who don't speak our native languages very well, or who can't read or write it, or who have to code switch between when they go home and take off their shoes and eat that food, and, growing up embarrassed of bringing friends home to your house because it smells weird, or your parents don't speak English that well. So it's really interesting to me that like Charlene and I have a lot more in common than, let's say, somebody who just came here from China today than I would, you know what I mean? So it's about those common experiences, even if it's not language. And there's also so much sort of commonality in sort of Asian cultures, the fact that we express love with food. I am lobbying for whoever's in charge of the idea of love languages, that we have to add feeding people as the sixth love language.
Yeah.
Because that's what our parents do. They don't necessarily hug us or compliment us or say they love you, but they will pack you a shit ton of food whenever you go anywhere. I saw a tweet or a post recently. It said something like, my parents know that I'm gay, but we've never talked about it. And the last time my boyfriend and I went to the park, my dad packed me a huge Tupperware full of sliced fruit. And that was his way of saying, I love you and I accept you. Yeah. And it's just like, that's so Asian,
It's so Asian. And I related to that. So I was like, that is that they're never going to say necessarily, I love you, but they're going to cut up some fruit for you and make something for you.
Have you eaten yet is the way they express.
Exactly.
You haven't eaten enough. I totally agree with Dan on that. I mean, if you look at the co-creators of our podcast, Where Are Y'all Really From? You have me, who's Philippine, who identifies as a Filipina Kentuckian, but Filipino immigrant. Dan, who's Chinese. You have May, who's Thai, May Cermak, who's Thai, and Nima Kulkarni, who's South Indian. And so you have like this really diverse ethnic group, but we have so many similar experiences where we just like are on the phone or at, you know, for hours talking about, you know, trying to figure out how to manage the relationship with our parents, trying to figure out how we are raising our children and what that means for them, trying to figure out like what we're cooking for Thanksgiving and like all of these different like similarities that we have. But yeah, I totally agree with Dan on that.
I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Like, it's just how you look at it's just your own perspective, right? Because like some Asian American folks look at that diversity as a hindrance, as a liability. Like, well, these are 4 very distinct ethnic groups with their own languages and their own food and their own, you know, cultures. There is no connection other than that, and therefore Asian Americans shouldn't be a thing. And I look at it as like beautiful. Like, that's the point of the quote unquote Asian American idea, is that it's inclusive. It's that, again, I always think of Asian America as a microcosm of what we want America to be, like this very inclusive, multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple religions, multiple foods living together.
Yeah.
I bristle at the notion that Asian American identity is this made up bullshit thing that should just go away because no one has anything in common. And I just find that terribly cynical. And
yeah. I feel like when it comes down to like doing the work of organizing and activism, it is going to come down to sort of second generation folks, those third culture kids, those kids who were born here, came here as a kid, or even third generation further down. Because if you look at the immigration history of America, this recent couple of generations didn't really get here till after the 60s, after the immigration laws changed.
65,
so the biggest waves came in the 70s and 80s, which is our parents, right? And so our parents, my parents, may not have a whole lot to say necessarily with Charlene's parents, or you know, maybe more with Keith's parents, you know, but they don't have necessarily those sort of common bonds. But you know,
I don't know, your parents Cantonese, because if they're not, they're probably not.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Like even Chinese doesn't have like a
yeah. You're right. That's like a whole different country. It's like a whole different. I realized. So I grew up in Kentucky, but I've also lived in San Francisco and New York. Mm-hmm. And every time I went into Chinatown to try to like order food, I always felt a little snubbed because I was speaking Mandarin instead of Cantonese. And I feel like just like, wait, am I getting skipped again? Like, hey, hello, you know, like, should I try English? Would that be better?
Maybe.
Yeah. So, but I think it's going to come down to sort of our generation, because we don't look at the differences of sort of national background as any sort of hindrance or dividing factor. We just look at it as like, yes, we've had similar experiences in this country, similar struggles. We understand each other's parents. We understand a lot of these sort of cultural things, even if all the nuances are different. And it's going to take, I think, this generation and the next generation to really kind of galvanize and solidify the idea of Asian Americanness.
Absolutely. And like, I look at my daughter as like truly Asian American. As you said, as a third culture kid, as the children of immigrants, you almost, our generation's experiences are vastly different from our children's experiences, and will be, you know, what they go through. Like, you know, everyone talks about the lunchbox moment, and like my daughter is now, she's in high school, but she never had it, right? Like when she was growing up, the kids saw a bento box and was like, whoa, that's cool. You know what I mean? Whereas like if one of us brought something like noodles or whatever to school, it would just be like, you're so weird. Yeah. But that, again, that's the progress that, you know, having this project engenders.
To go back on that a little bit, I don't know, actually. I don't know if they would have that lunchbox moment. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like they're like maybe in some of like in Atlanta or Nashville or maybe even Louisville and Lexington. But if we're talking about all the AAPI folk in the South, like there are a lot of rural communities that they're still trying, you know, they don't have other people there. Like, I mean, I can't say that if I was growing up in Northern Kentucky right now and in 2021 and brought a lunchbox with chicken adobo, you know, like I did in the 90s in California, that I wouldn't have that moment yet, or that my son wouldn't, or my kids wouldn't have that moment. I think that, again, I do, there's just anti-AAPI hate is still very predominant. It's still around, you know? So I do think that there's going to be, like, we definitely have come a long way, but clearly given the events of this year, we still have a very long way to go. And our children are going to have to carry some of that burden. I mean, it might be easier because of all that's out there now, but they still have a very big hill to climb.
Yeah, absolutely. And right. And I did not mean to imply like we have transcended race and racism as Asian Americans or anything like that. But that is absolutely right. The cognitive dissonance of like growing up, had there been anything similar to like Shang-Chi, right? Like the fact that there's an Asian American superhero movie, like what the fuck? You know what I mean? Like that was never a thing. An Asian American there's always like Chinese kung fu flicks, but like a guy who speaks English, wears Jordans, and is like a Marvel hero. Get out of here. That's not, and like, but we should also, to your point, Charlene, not mistake like media representation as like the be on end on. And I think one of the critiques of the Asian American like political activism is that like we are very focused on like getting a movie and not necessarily getting the vote out, right? So I will concede on that point. But let me ask you guys, I didn't want to go too far without asking where y'all really from, since that is the name of your podcast, particularly how each of you and your families ended up in Kentucky. So let's start with you, Charlene. You have an interesting story that you grew up as an undocumented immigrant in northern Kentucky. Is that right? Yeah.
So we moved to I was born in Marikina or Manila, Philippines. And we moved to California when I was almost 5 or so. A very similar stories to many undocumented immigrants is that we came on a travel visa and that visa had expired. And some of the details are very fuzzy. I mean, like this might be one of the first times I've talked about this, but like
exclusive.
This is an exclusive because I had to like talk to my mom about it. But there's a lot of embarrassment and shame around this story.
Sure.
And it wasn't until I was deep in my 30s until I was able to sit down with my mom and say, tell me what really happened, because I don't know. And so there's still a lot of details very blurry about that. But essentially, we had moved from California to Kentucky because of a job that my mom had. And it was just me and my mom. We were undocumented. There are many times that we had kind of like an exit strategy in the event that things might happen. I was having to be left alone often because she was working. And so that was a big part of like my childhood. It wasn't until I was around 16 or so. And this was, 2001, but it was the year before September 11th happened. And we filed for naturalization. My dad did for me. And he got naturalized actually because of various things, but essentially there was some like legal work that had to happen and he was able to get naturalization. So through him, I was also naturalized when I was 16. Of course, 2005 is when ICE happened. So it's a lot harder now post ICE creation. I was naturalized. Then I went to college, which ended me up in Lexington. I moved to Atlanta for 7 years because my husband was getting his PhD. And then we had a baby and decided we needed help. So we moved back to Kentucky and here I am in Louisville. So it's kind of like a journey of all that had happened. But yeah, that I still say though, like I grew up in Kentucky because it's where I call home.
Right. And Dan, you're also like you were born in China, but did you come directly to Kentucky from China or did you bounce around before you ended up in Kentucky?
Yeah, so my parents, rewind a little bit to the Cultural Revolution. My parents met in a starch factory in Inner Mongolia, which is the Siberia of China, for those who don't know. Because of their quote unquote bad political family histories, they were both just kind of like shipped off to the middle of nowhere where they lived for 10 years. They got married, they had me. And when Deng Xiaoping started opening China up to the West and to travel and to immigration, my dad started just applying to every school in America. And he went for the first school that offered him any money. And it was North Dakota State University in Fargo.
Nice.
And then my mom and I followed him about a year after, which is how we ended up in Fargo first. And then a job brought him to Lexington. And, what Charlene says about ICE and the way immigration laws have changed, it took us years and decades to get our permanent residence and then to get our citizenship. So when people say like, oh, people shouldn't be doing things illegally and they need to just like, go through the system and do all the things the right ways. I don't know if you've seen, there's been this like amazing flow chart that somebody has created of like, if this, then this, then this. And it's somewhere near impossible right now to navigate the legal system of immigration. Like the system itself is broken. And unfortunately, we have even people like our parents' generation who are saying the same shit about like, oh, people these days need to like do things the legal way, sometimes forgetting the travails that they went through, and also not realizing like things are not what they were in the 80s and the 90s. Things have vastly changed.
I mean, even like growing up, it took 10 years to even get the permanent residence. My family had to give all of our savings to a lawyer, and that was $5,000, and kind of got screwed over by that lawyer. So we had to find another family friend who was a lawyer that was able to like file the paperwork. So if you don't have even access to a lawyer and have the means to even do that, like you're totally screwed. You're totally screwed. And that was, again, before ICE. I mean, and I did misspeak. ICE was created in 2003. So my experience as a formerly and undocumented immigrant, although does have the same, when I think back to that time, a lot of fear, a lot of like planning, a lot of like, hush, hush, you need to not, talk about home life or whatever. Times 100 of what is happening to immigrants now is really, I mean, it's awful. It's horrible. We got to like burn the system down. But it was there to keep immigrants out. It's there to put, and ICE is there.
Yeah, there's a reason why it's so complicated, because ultimately, like they don't want immigrants. And especially brown and non-white immigrants, right? Like even Trump would say, well, if they came from Scandinavia, right? Like that's fine. But if you're coming from any brown countries, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to get in.
Yeah. And I'll edit what I said earlier when I said the immigration system is broken. The immigration system is working as designed.
Exactly.
Yeah,
is what it is.
It's supposed to be broken.
Yeah.
So you were in Fargo. Like, were you too little to remember what it was like?
No, I came here when I was 8. What I remember about Fargo was that everyone owned a snowsuit. we could build little igloos and snow forts every single year, and that Fargo had its shit together when it came to snow, because it would snow a couple of feet overnight, and by the morning, when it was time to walk to school, all the roads were plowed, all the sidewalks were plowed and salted. There were just giant walls of shoveled snow. I don't think I knew what a snow day was until I moved to Kentucky.
Right. Yeah, that's the one thing the South does not do well, is like handle snow. That's
they really don't.
Well, I wanted to ask, because like the thing about Kentucky, and especially like Charlene, you kind of lived in northern Kentucky, and then like I think Lexington and Louisville, there's like Louisville's a little bit closer to like the border. And this is a debate, right? Like when booking guests for this show in particular, I was like, where they grew up in Missouri. Is Missouri the South, right? Like and Kentucky's kind of on that borderline between the South, right, and the Midwest. And the reason I asked about, South Dakota is not technically, I guess it's Midwest. I don't know, what is South Dakota? It's the middle of nowhere. But is South Dakota Midwest? I guess it's Midwest.
Sure.
But like Kentucky's kind of like straddles the line between Midwest and South. Like, but you guys clearly identify as Southern, right?
Yes, for the most part. It's so funny because we, the Mason-Dixon line went through Lexington, like where I went to undergrad. It cuts through on the other side of the college. And so Lexington does have a very like distinct Southern culture, whereas like Louisville, and again, I've only been here for like 3 years, but like it definitely has more of like a Midwest vibe. So what's funny, and this was brought up when we were talking about this show, they were like, Charlene, you don't say y'all often. Like sometimes you say you all, sometimes you, and I was like, right, I forget, because like you all is very much like a Midwestern saying. And so in Northern Kentucky, I would say, you all. It wasn't until like really I went down to Lexington for undergrad where I started saying y'all. And now, like, I'm married to a Western Kentucky person who's like, again, kind of more relates to like that Midwest Southern line. And so we both say you all. And so it's just funny because even in Kentucky, there's like all these like really like very small distinctions of being Southern. But I do think like culturally, Kentucky as a whole is very Southern, that very centered family vibe, traditions, all of those things.
Listen, our show is called Where Y'all Really From? And after we started recording the first few episodes, we had to have a chat with Charlene and be like, we need some branding consistency here, because you can't say y'all and then you all and then y'all and then you all again. Like, we gotta get this straightened out. Yeah, I feel very much that Kentucky and Lexington is the South. And it'd be a weird thing. I don't think I've ever said the sentence, I am a Southerner. But I have very much in recent years put a real claim on the idea that I'm a Lexingtonian and that I'm a Kentuckian. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we did a video campaign called I Am a Kentuckian, where we got a whole bunch of folks from other places kind of making that proclamation, talking about, I'm from the Philippines, but I'm a Kentuckian. I'm from, Sudan, but I'm a Kentuckian. And I think not just places in the South, but I think every place in the world, people love to keep other people out. People love to keep other people out of their identity, to say like, well, to be a true Kentuckian, you'll have to have been here for generations, or you'll have to eat this way or talk this way or drink this beverage or be into bourbon or whatever it is. They have all this gatekeeping, criteria, right? And so much of that, if not all of it, is rooted in racism, rooted in the idea that you can't possibly belong here. And that speaks to the title of our show. The thesis of our show is that word really, right? Because it's that interrogation. And so I always, have these conversations with friends and other people. It's like, what does it take for me to be a Kentuckian? I have lived in Kentucky off and on for 26 years. Is that enough? I've raised a family here. Is that enough? I bought a house here. Is that enough? I've started a business here. Is that enough? I am currently running for local office. Is that enough? You know what I mean? It's just like, and a friend of mine made a really good point. Actually, one of our interviewees, Danny Quintos, who's a local poet, she made a really good point. All the different things that I said, if I do X, Y, and Z, am I a Kentuckian? She said, those are all privileged things. To be able to raise a kid, buy a house, start a business, those are very privileged things, right? So now let's think about an undocumented, migrant worker who's working the tobacco fields or working, some industry here, or, off a fishing boat, off of, Oregon. Are they a real American? Are they a real Oregonian? Are they a real Virginian or Kentuckian? Like, what does it take, right? And I really want to kind of shatter through that. Like, I want to say, like, you're a true whatever if you say you are. That's it.
Exactly.
That's all it takes. You know what I mean? You shouldn't have somebody else gatekeep and tell you what you can or cannot be.
And I think that's beautifully said. And it's also like when you mentioned that you've never said the word I am a Southerner, because I think similarly, right, the idea of Southerner, like, what does that engage in your mind, right? Like, and in particular for folks who are not from the South, right? Like, Charlene started the conversation talking about the South's long history with racism and slavery, and then it's a stain that is forever part of the South. But I also tell people that it's, first of all, racism is not the sole domain of the South, because a lot of people from the North act like, oh, you from the South, you must have dealt with a lot of racism. Like, yeah, you grew up in Staten Island. I'm sure you dealt with a lot of racism too. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just because I grew up, I probably dealt with less racism than you did, because you just had a bunch of like white folks too. Like, racism might be the domain of whiteness. Let's say that. It's not necessarily the domain of the South, right? But that kind of like dismissal of like, it's just rednecks and MAGA folk, like, ignores the fact that there are Asian Americans in the South. There are whole swaths of Black American, people of color, LGBTQ folks, like progressively minded people are also part of the South. So like, you say you're running for office. I'm so happy to hear that you're running for local office, because I feel like one of the reasons we kind of dismiss the South and write off the South is like, well, that's just Republicans. It's just red. We'll never unseat Mitch McConnell, like all that stuff. It's defeat. It's self-defeatist, because like there are pockets, more than pockets, of progressive people of color, marginalized communities, immigrants, all over the South. Like, we just saw in the last election cycle, Georgia finally breaking through. Stacey Abrams is running for governor again. There are 2 Democratic senators from Georgia. Like, that was unheard of. I'm from Virginia. I know we just like fucked up the governor's race, but like,
I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to say it.
I know. I mean, at least you guys were smart enough to elect a Democratic governor a couple years ago. That was wild. You know, Virginia had become a blue state, like a solidly blue state for a political generation at least. So like it's possible, you know, and I think when we just assume well the South is just all racist and white people, we ignore the possibility of claiming the South as our own. And I think that's part of like even the hesitancy of saying I'm a Southerner. Like, no, I'm proud Virginian. I'm a proud Southerner, but I'm redefining what that means. Because like a generation from now, we don't forget the history, but we can redefine and reclaim what it means to be Southern for us. Right.
That's right.
I do think that's like the fabric to it. Like that's the story of, that's the immigrant story, right? Because we all have been transplanted into the South. Now we're like rooting with like our families and all these different things. But even in our parents' generation, they had to deal with, they assimilated because that was their way to survive, that they were put here into a predominantly white space that they've never been. I mean, these are people who are like well into their adulthood. So the first 30 years, 40 years of their lives, they had never been the minority. And so now they're here to be the minority and to have experiences that they've never experienced before. And in our parents' cases, raise children and to try to navigate that. So assimilation was a way for them to survive. And now we're seeing that like, okay, we belong here. We need to reclaim this because we're rooted in this. And assimilation is, we can't just survive, we need to thrive in this. I do think that representation is a huge, huge part of that. I also think storytelling is a huge part of that because like I said, 1.9% of the population of Kentucky is AAPI. That's not a lot of people in terms of percentage. It's a lot of people that you could mobilize in terms of numbers. That's 70,000 people. And actually doing this podcast has been really, really interesting because people have reached out to me to say, like, I had never thought, like people who I actually grew up with and went to school with, it was like, I've never really recognized my Asianness because I had to, like, it was better for me growing up to not. And it wasn't until I realized there was all of these very similar stories that, you know, I should reclaim that. And so it really starts like individually, but like as a collective, I feel like we're only now getting into a point where assimilation and survival is not enough. Like we had, like now that we're thriving. And so I think it's a very new concept, even though we've been here for decades, it just wasn't really an option because it is a very privileged thing to say, you know, well, now I can do X, Y, and Z. And our parents didn't have that choice. It wasn't actually until I went to Atlanta when I was like, oh yeah, I'm Southerner too. It was expanding that identity that we had talked about earlier. Like when I moved to Atlanta, I was like, I don't want to like name drop brands, but they have a really great branding that's based in like the South. And I was like, yes, I feel that so hard because I've had those same similar experiences. And so I guess technically I am a Southerner, but I'm also like a Kentuckian. And of course, I self-identify as Filipino Kentuckian, Kentuckian. But I've never, like similar to Dan, I've never said the words I'm a Southerner, even though I've felt it. I know it now. I'm like starting to recognize. So yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So much about what Charlene said, I want to kind of amplify, like talking about our parents surviving. I mean, I was envisioning, you know, she said the word planted. I was envisioning taking a plant from wherever and literally going somewhere that you didn't necessarily even choose, or, you know, in terms of like the way refugees come here, or just someplace that you have no idea what it is. And imagine taking that plant and replanting it there, having no idea what this climate is, what the soil is, what the temperatures are, and not knowing if you'll survive, and then surviving. Like how hardy, how resilient were our parents' generation and that first generation of folks. And we can't thrive until they survived. You know what I mean? Like they laid the groundwork. We can see the horizon because we are standing on their shoulders and we owe them a lot. In terms of branding, I think that's an interesting thing too. A lot of folks talk about Lexington as having a really strong brand, being in the bluegrass. And when you ask folks, what are the three things you think of when you think of Lexington? It's bourbon, basketball, horses, right? And I'm really trying, as just sort of a community activist and organizer and hopefully future council member, is to kind of help redefine the things that we're about. We have an amazing array of food from all over the world in this town. We have really cool microbreweries. We've got amazing public art on murals all over town. Frequently, friends on Facebook will say, hey, I have a friend coming in from out of town. What are some good like Lexington places I should take them to eat, or Kentucky cuisine or whatever? And I'm like, well, we've got great Korean barbecue. There's this really great little Thai dive in the downtown. We've got sushi, we've got pho, we've got West African food. And I don't name anything that you would think of as just like traditionally Southern. I'm not naming places with biscuits and gravy because I want to keep redefining, like, yeah, this is Lexington cuisine. This is Kentucky cuisine. Kentucky cuisine is not just defined as, first of all, white Southern food stolen from Black folks. Let's be perfectly honest. But we have to keep redefining it. And I think it's our privilege and our obligation to continue to redefine what it means to be a Kentuckian, a Virginian, a Southerner, and an American.
Absolutely. 100%. That is a perfect segue for our final segment on Southern Fried Asian, because we already mentioned earlier that Asians and Southerners express their love for one another in one way and one way only, and that's through food. So you kind of touched on it about what's going on in the culinary scene in Kentucky now, but I want you to think back to like when you were a kid and growing up. What's the thing that, like, if you're out of town and, in a post-COVID world, I don't know the last time you were out of town, but like when you're not in Lexington or Louisville, what's something that brings you back to like when I was growing up in those places, or in your case, Charlene, Northern Kentucky? Like what's a dish or a cuisine or just a meal that you had that always brings you back home?
For me, it's definitely my mom's chicken adobo. Like we had always, of course, as any good Asian home has a rice cooker with rice in it at all times. And so she always had, she would at least weekly would cook chicken adobo, which actually in high school, I had friends who would like come over after school, like even when I wasn't there, to like eat the chicken adobo.
Such a betrayal. You're not even there.
I'm not even there because like that was like the thing that I was like, my mom's cooking was known for. But just even when I think of growing up too, which is I think is wild, like in high school, there's a great Indian restaurant in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati is like right over the river. It's like 20 minutes away from where I grew up. And it's in India. It's called Ambar, and it's Northern Indian food. And when I think back to growing up, that is what brings me back. Like if I were to go visit there, that would like instantly bring me back to growing up in Northern Kentucky, which I think, to Dan's point, which is really interesting. It's not just like Skyline chili, which is in Northern Kentucky. It's not just like fried chicken. Like there was a lot of diversity there that people don't equate Kentucky to. But yeah, my childhood memory, every time I take a bite of my mom's chicken adobo, instantly brings me back to childhood.
Nice.
Yeah. Even growing up in the 90s in Lexington, which is not what it is today. First time I ever had sushi was in Lexington. First time I ever had Korean barbecue was in Lexington. First time I ever had Thai food was in Lexington. Some of those places are still around 20 plus years later. Those are the things that really tie me to here, not even necessarily what is quote unquote a distinctive food. I will say, and biscuits and gravy does not belong to Kentucky, but any breakfast or brunch place I go, if there's biscuits and gravy on it, everything else just like fades out. And I have to get, especially if it's sausage gravy. I don't know what it is. I mean, we in the South, we love to like stack carbs on top of carbs on top of carbs. It's like a biscuit is made out of flour and gravy is also made out of flour. And we're just like, keep stacking it. The one thing that really brings me back to my childhood, we were talking about, Charlene said that when she was little, she was left alone a lot because her mom had to work. I grew up a latchkey kid, so I kind of learned to cook for myself. And the first thing that I ever made for myself at home, watching G.I. Joe or Transformers after school, was scrambled eggs and ketchup. And I would like to
I've had that too.
Yeah, I wanted to think I invented that because that is not a menu item that you ever see anywhere and probably shouldn't. It's not a great dish, but scrambled eggs Chinese style. So they're not runny. They're like hard and a little brown on the outside because we cook everything on high heat. You know, we don't do that medium setting at all. So yeah, scrambled eggs and ketchup. I don't think I've actually made it since I was a kid. I keep thinking I want to, and then I get a little scared.
The Filipino twist, Dan, is like having banana ketchup. So I need
right.
Give that to you. Give that to you next time I see you.
Well, I was going to say,
a little spam.
My wife is Japanese, and they have a dish called omurice, which is basically ketchup fried rice inside an omelet with ketchup on top. So that's like, that's all you do.
Yeah.
Do some omurice. You should open up an omurice shop somewhere in Lexington, and I think that would like do hot business. Anyway, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time, but I hope to have you back on. Is there going to be more seasons of Where Y'all Really From?
We hope so. Yeah, we have all kinds of ideas. We already have a long short list of potential guests for next season. So yeah, we're waiting to hear back from a few things. Hopefully we'd love to do a season 2 because there's so many more stories to tell.
Absolutely.
I'm the only one of our co-creators that have not run for office. So there's a lot of, and I'm not going to run for office, but there's a lot of things that are happening in the next couple of years. So but yes, we do plan to have season 2, and hopefully it will, the hope is that we're going to get deeper into some of the topics, and just, I would love to like do lots of various episodes of touching base on, Asian allyship and what happened with anti-Blackness in the Asian community, like LGBTQ folk who are coming out to their very conservative Asian parents. All of these like really great topics that we haven't touched yet on season 1. And so I'd love to get deeper into a lot of that.
Before we go into your own personal social media accounts, how can folks who are listening to Southern Fried Asia, because I feel like there's going to be a audience overlap, how can they find Where Y'all Really From? And then after that, if Dan and Charlene, you can share with us how they can find you in particular on the internet.
Sure. Our website is whereyallreallyfrom.org from Louisville Public Media. And then you could also stream us on NPR and Apple and also Spotify, I believe.
Spotify. Yeah. I just have to say real quick how much it blew my mind that we could find our podcast on npr.org. Like I've made it. I think I've peaked officially
on the NPR app. That was, I think, on my holiday card.
Yeah. No, I think that's going to be like on all of our business cards from now on. We're officially NPR podcasters.
Yeah, it's like you and Steve Inskeep. It's like boom. That's the
wow.
Well, no, like the first day that we launched the show, when the first episode premiered, I was scrolling through my Apple podcast feed, and there, right next to, it was like NPR Politics Podcast, Pop Culture Happy Hour, It's Been a Minute, was our show. And I was just like,
that like blew his mind. I was like, cool.
Yeah.
That is kind of a big deal, isn't
it? Yeah.
So Dan, how can people find you in particular on the internet beyond the NPR app?
Yes. My personal account on, I'm more on Instagram than Facebook. Instagram is Atomic Ramen. That kind of was a business/personal site. And then my campaign stuff is all Dan Wu for Lex on Instagram, on Facebook. And the campaign website is danwuforlex.com, running for city council in Lexington in 2022. So
awesome.
There you go.
That's very cool. Charlene, where can people find you on the internet?
Keith, I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know. I'm not very good with my social media, but I do have the account. So my Instagram is at Charlene B with 3 E's, both E's, CharleneeB. And then my Twitter is at Charlene_Ann. But I will be completely honest, I'm not great at social media. So Dan has all of our branding and everything, but yeah, this is a whole new world. Like I said, we just started like 6 months ago. Like, wow, this is like wild that we're doing these interviews in media and like having, going to all these things, because I did not anticipate that.
Well, I will say from experience, people like, it blows their mind to know that there are Asians in the South. So keep doing what you're doing. Fingers crossed for season 2. And thank you so much for being on Southern Fried Asian. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Keith. And we could You and I could do a separate episode and just talk about all the toys in your background.
Let's do that. Let's
totally.
Yeah. I was going to say, I have to show you all the toys in my basement now.
You know, I do have another podcast where we just talk to toy collectors. So we can
Here we
nerd
go.
out for an hour.
Here we go.
Talk about the real stuff. Who cares about like politics and racism?
I know, right? Like you and Dan, like when I saw your video, I was like, Dan's mind is exploding now.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You can find me, Keith Chow, on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow. Follow the podcast at Southern Asians on Twitter and at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock Media Network. Subscribe and download Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Support us on patreon.com/thenerdscolor. Also find us on GoFundMe. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jef Vu. Email us thenerdscolor@gmail.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thenerdscolor. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.